I'm going to just kick it off with a little bit of brief history. Let's just put into context a little bit about pulmonary hypertension and a little bit about definitions that I think it'll be important for you to have under your belts as we approach this research seminar today. So pulmonary hypertension is a relatively young field. It was 1951 when we had the first definition of pulmonary hypertension. And then we saw the epidemics with diet drugs, weight loss drugs. Aminorex in Europe led to a huge epidemic of pulmonary arterial hypertension. And that led to the first World Symposium on pulmonary hypertension. That's where people started to get together and actually talk about definitions. We didn't have any therapy until 1981, and that was with the first heart-lung transplant in the world at Stanford, and that was performed in a patient with pulmonary arterial hypertension. In 1990, we saw our first medical therapy when epoprostenol was the first drug to significantly improve survival in PAH. And then in 1999, we had the second World Symposium, and that's where we come up with the 5 World Health Organization group classification system. We had our first oral medication as recently as 2002, and that was Bosentan, or Tracleer, if some of the members of the audience are familiar or on that medication. And then in 2003, there was the third World Symposium. We started really talking about definitions, finding mutations. 2005 is the second oral medication, sildenafil, Revatio, aka Viagra, that some people may know of as that medication. In 2008, there was another World Symposium. These are meetings where people come together from all over the world to discuss definitions and treatment strategies, etc. 2013, we had a new class of medication, the first guanylate cyclase stimulator. And again, the classification system evolves, as does risk stratification and how we treat patients. And in 2015, we start really publishing clinical trial data that supports not just using one medication at a time, switching to another medication, but actually putting people on dual upfront combination therapy. And multiple trials supported about that, but the AMBITION trial was really key and pivotal in providing us with those data and changing patient outcomes. And then, of course, we had the most recent, or the 6th World Symposium in 2015. So over time, we've had 14 FDA-approved medications for pulmonary arterial hypertension. This is by the end of 2018, actually by now, 2020. And we also developed differences in how we actually use these medications, meaning we use multiple drugs up front, and so that strategy is really important. We use risk stratification to try to determine who's sicker and needs which therapy. So there are algorithms and strategies involved, but PAH is still a chronic and progressive disease, and we still need research to get us further along the line. So we're going to talk about research today. Our goals today are to share the latest exciting research findings in the field of pulmonary hypertension. We're going to give you a glimpse into the lab and PH research with literally behind the scenes tours so you can see what it looks like. We're going to announce our 2020 Phenomenal Impact Research Award recipient and also hear from our 2019 recipient. And most of all, we want to answer your questions about PH research. So we hope it'll be an interactive day today. This is our agenda. It's rough, but I'll try to keep us to it and on time as best as we can. But we'll start just to give you an overview. The first portion is going to be devoted to clinical research and novel devices that we use in humans, so sort of human-based research. Then we'll talk with Jan Janis to get a patient perspective, and we'll have clinical research questions and answers. And then afterwards, we're going to go into the lab with Dr. Charlie Lai and with Vineet Agrawal talking to us about preclinical research. And then we'll talk about our 2020 Phenomenal Impact Award recipients. So before we get started in the nuts and bolts of it, the meat of it, I want to give you some nuts and bolts. So first off, I think most of the people in this audience know this, but pulmonary hypertension is defined as increased pressure in the pulmonary arteries. We can screen for it on echocardiogram, but we define it by right-sided heart catheterization, and it's defined as a mean pulmonary artery pressure of 25 or higher. And there's different types of pulmonary hypertension. We put them into different groups because we treat them according to to the different group types, because that's what's really driving those high pressures. So there's 5 groups, 5 classifications. And when I'm in my clinic, I often draw this number, this figure of circulation. So I don't know if you guys can see my pointer. Can you guys see that?
Yep.
So we talk about how blood goes. If you understand the quote circuit, then you're going to understand the different groups. So people can have high blood pressure in the arteries of their lungs because the arteries themselves are stiff. And that's called pulmonary arterial hypertension. Blood goes from the lungs to the left side of the heart, which pumps to your body, right? So the second type is if the left side of the heart is not working like efficiently, either somebody has a poor pump or they have a good pump, but it's really stiff, so it can't fill before the next squeeze, or if they have leaky valves, then they'll get back pressures into the lungs from the left side of the heart. That's called pulmonary hypertension due to left heart disease. The third type is pulmonary hypertension due to chronic lung disease or chronically low oxygen levels. So people who might have untreated sleep apnea or who might have pulmonary fibrosis, COPD, they can have PH due to lung disease. The fourth type is pulmonary hypertension due to blood clots that have turned into scar tissue. We call that chronic thromboembolic PH. And then the fifth type is pulmonary hypertension due to miscellaneous causes, things that don't fit into those categories. So when we have these different categories, we treat them differently. Group 2, we focus on the left side of the heart. Group 3, we focus on their lung disease. Group 1, that's really the type of pulmonary hypertension where we put our PAH medications towards. So you'll probably be hearing about each of those different types today, at least in some way, shape, or form, or most of them. I also want to give you a framework of like terms that we use in research, because you'll hear things like basic research, clinical research, what does it all mean? So I got this terminology from a website. I liked how they put these terms. So basic science research is really like the question of how does it work? Coming up with a question, what is the mechanism of pulmonary hypertension in this scenario, for example, or what is the gene involved? So that's what we would call basic science research. It asks that question, how does it work? Oftentimes we're looking at, you're coming up with an idea, it's cellular models, etc. Translational research is where you have somebody who has this finding and they ask, how can I turn this into something useful? We figured out this little mechanism or this pathway that we use these words of how things work. How can we take that and either apply a medication or a chemical that'll affect patients? And clinical research is when things get to clinical trials. Is it really useful? So people have to actually test these things in patients, and that's clinical research. And one way of viewing it is by looking at this research pipeline. So preclinical research is like the period where you have drug discovery and development. So that's time in the lab and coming up with plausible possibilities, whether it's candidate drugs on a drug screen or looking at cells and animal models. That's preclinical research. And you'll hear a lot about that with Dr. Lai's talk today. Phase 1 research, once you have a drug that you're thinking about using, then you have to test it in healthy people to make sure it's safe, that they can tolerate it, what are the side effects. Then it goes to phase 2 research, and these are small scale trials in patients who have the disease. And so in that, you're assessing the efficacy, you're looking at different dosages that may be used. So that's what we call phase 2 clinical trials, and you'll hear about a phase 2 trial today. Phase 3 clinical trials are the large scale, randomized, double-blinded, controlled clinical trials. Like the Ambition study, for example. And so those are ones that involve thousands of participants. And once we get data from, phase 1, 2, and then 3 trials, and you have to go in that order, then a drug can be submitted to the FDA in the United States for approval. So then that takes a period of time to review those data, and then the drug's approved. And even after the drug is approved, there are further research studies, what we call post-marketing surveillance or phase 4, to make sure that it's safe, because once it goes into thousands of participants, it's important to know that there's not something we didn't uncover in the smaller size studies. So, and you can see down here, it takes a long time to get a drug from a concept to market, over 10 years on average, and sometimes obviously longer. So a lot goes into this.